Doncs benvinguts i benvingudes a aquesta sessió sobre les eleccions midterms americanes. Tenim dos ponents de luxe. Faré una petita introducció i, com ja havíem avisat, passarem a l'anglès per la taula rodona, pel debat. Però, com bé sabeu, la inflació, l'avortament, els drets reproductius, els drets de les persones LGTBI+, la frontera, hem vist vídeos i fotografies d'autobusos plens de migrants que el governador de Texas ha anat enviant a ciutats governades per demòcrates, han estat alguns dels elements principals de la campanya electoral d'aquestes midterms. A l'ombra, la possibilitat, ara sembla que confirmada, que l'expresident Trump torni a presentar-se a les eleccions presidencials del 2024, han marcat aquests comicis, on els partidaris de Trump no han estat tan exitosos com esperaven. Durant les eleccions, comentaristes i tertulians polítics diversos anunciaven una onada roja. Recordem que als Estats Units els republicans són representats pel vermell i els demòcrates pel blau, a l'inrevés que a casa nostra. Avui, com deia, tenim dos ponents de luxe. La Filipovic viu a Brooklyn, Nova York, és periodista i advocada. És autora de dos llibres que us els recomano molt. Un es diu OK Boomer, Let's Talk, How My Generation Got Left Behind. I l'altre, The Hate Spot, The Feminist Pursuit of Happiness. Actualment és columnista setmanal de la CNN i ha estat col·laboradora habitual del New York Times i The Guardian. En Pablo De La Rosa viu al Rio Grande Valley, a la frontera amb Mèxic. És periodista de Texas Public Radio i NPR. De fet, és el creador del primer telenotícies públic i diari en espanyol a Texas, un projecte que fa poques setmanes que ha començat i que està tenint molt d'èxit. El seu periodisme investigatiu ha estat essencial per donar a la llum diverses històries, com per exemple la crisi de l'aigua de l'estiu passat, que ha afectat sobretot a diverses comunitats racialitzades al sud dels Estats Units. So, without further ado, we'll get started. I just introduced Pablo and Jill, and we're really very happy that you joined us today. So thank you very much for agreeing to be here. I think you both represent some very interesting views to help us understand the midterm elections and what were some of the key issues, and also, what's happened, especially now that we kind of 2 weeks into it, I think, pretty much. So we're starting to see the first few days were a little bit unclear still with vote counts, and especially these elections have been really, really tight. And so, it's basically a matter of one seat either way that would make a difference. So we probably, I think at this point, a bit clearer. We also have the recent announcement of a possible Trump 2024. And so that's also kind of interesting to consider. My first kind of element I would like to explore is, what do you think are the key takeaways of the midterms for a non-US centric audience? And I think I'll kind of let Jill start with that, and we'll kind of switch around at each question.
Yeah, so, for me, the biggest lesson of the midterms was how much abortion factored into Democratic turnout and Democratic votes. There was a lot of talk before the election, including from, some folks on the left basically saying that voters care about pocketbook issues, abortion is this kind of third-tier social issue, and Democrats really need to focus on things like inflation and the economy and gas prices. And Democratic candidates did talk about those issues, but many of them did, certainly at the encouragement of feminist groups, but also of consultants who are studying what voters were paying attention to, did emphasize that they were the party that was going to try to protect reproductive choice. And at the same time, Republicans were launching these pretty significant attacks on abortion rights in conservative states, and then in their actual elections, trying to change the subject and, sort of throw their hands up and say, like, wait, who, me? We just don't want to talk about abortion. Let's talk about the economy. And what we saw in both the results of the election and then also in exit polling is that abortion was the #1 issue that got Democrats to the polls by like a long shot. when you look at what Democrats said was their number one issue, abortion was not only the number one issue for Democrats, but the second most important issue was like, half as important as abortion, or important to half as many people. So, I do think one lesson is that fundamental rights matter quite a bit to Democratic voters. And that, as always, the goal in any election is both to turn out folks who support you and then also to persuade folks in the middle. And that abortion is a really winning issue for Democratic voters and for moderate voters. I think it's very telling that we're seeing Democrats kind of process that reality, and we're still seeing Republicans very much avoid the issue, and I think refuse to reckon with how badly their party was damaged by their extreme anti-abortion positions.
Yeah, excellent, thanks. Pablo, what do you think for you have been kind of the key lessons or takeaways?
Yeah, I mean, we saw a lot of extreme positions, regressive positions on issues like abortion. Here in Texas, we saw a lot of regressive positions on immigration, human rights, on the humanitarian crisis we have happening right here in the Rio Grande Valley. To zoom out a little bit, I think one of the key takeaways for me, just overall for the whole thing, and I think we're seeing it in the headlines right now on the Democratic side. We've had Nancy Pelosi recently announced that she won't come back to lead the House. I think her words were, it's time for a new generation to lead, or the time has come for a new generation to lead. On the Republican side, we're seeing a lot of coverage about how Trump is kind of over. Most of the candidates that he backed lost in congressional races across the country. So I think for me, the big thing, is that the party seemed ready, at least partially, to begin moving on to new things on both sides, although that, might take some time and a few more election cycles. But I think we're about to see maybe some more fundamental changes in both parties as a result of these elections. We have already kind of seen a few breakthroughs in terms of representation and some of the outcomes of these elections. And then I think the second takeaway for me as well was that Latinos played a huge role in these midterms. We're the second largest voting bloc in the US. Obviously, we don't vote together. So I think overall 10 points more Latino votes went to the GOP in comparison to 4 years ago. But 2/3 of Latino voters supported Democratic candidates, so that's still the same. But one thing that I wanted to highlight was not so much who voted for what party, but also that despite that Latinos played such a big role and that we have a lot of Latino candidates coming in, the representation in elected office is still pretty low. We're pretty far away. I mean, at the largest scale, Latinos in public offices are represented maybe less than 2% of elected officials nationwide are Latino, but we're 18% of the population. So celebrating along with the headlines about all of the women, Latinos, black people in office. But I think for the Latino demographic and for a lot of other demographics, there's still a long way to go.
Yeah, I actually ran the numbers on that in my newsletter. The Rutgers Center for American Women in Politics put out representation numbers after this election cycle. And yeah, I mean, Latina women make up roughly 9.5% of the population, right? But they're going to only make up 4% of all seats in the House and 1% of all seats in the Senate. So there are huge underrepresentation issues. There's only a single Latina governor, despite a record number of female governors just having been elected this term. So, I mean, that's true kind of across the board, right? That women of color generally are underrepresented, but I think it's useful to look at those population numbers and then the actual numbers of seats that those folks hold.
Yeah, you're just making me think, actually, it would be quite interesting as well to see the numbers in places like Texas and Florida, which are kind of places that the Latino vote seems to be extremely important. You know, Texas now pretty much kind of Latino populations almost overtaking any other group in demographic terms, but a Texas House and a Texas Senate that are extremely male and extremely white in a few ways. So yeah, those are kind of really. Sorry, I muted myself. So the next question is looking at the kind of final result, in a sense, in the House and to an extent in the Senate, which has been a very tight result. And so I wanted you guys to kind of tell us a little bit more what you think are going to be the implications for the governability of the United States, because it seems that, I think Pablo was highlighting a little bit of that, you know, we're kind of in an age, I suppose, of extremes. I was reading this morning as well, and to an extent that voters seem to be a little bit annoyed at what they perceive to be a move away from the center, and there seems to be a lot less kind of bipartisan initiatives that perhaps would have been the norm 15 or 20 years ago, or perhaps even earlier. So with the lack of possibility or the lack of real possibility of bipartisanship, what is the governability looking like for the next 2 years? What's going to be possible, I suppose? And we'll let Pablo start this time since Jill kicked us off.
Sure. Well, I'll say that, you know, as a reporter mostly covering the Rio Grande Valley and the state of Texas here, I don't follow congressional politics at that level outside of the elections, but to kind of extend the discussion we were just having, you know, the House that's going to take over in January it's one of the youngest, most diverse in a long time, despite everything we just talked about in terms of the long way we have to go towards representation, even on the Republican side. So I'm very curious how that will actually play out. Like I said before, you know, the first takeaway for me was that a lot of maybe fundamental things are changing, or at least the time is ripe for those changes to come in. So I'm a little bit curious and a little bit open-minded about how that might be. And so, you know, I'll be watching closely to see what that diversity actually means in this Congress.
I think we're looking forward to 2 gridlocked years, to be honest. You know, a House that's going to be very tightly divided, a Senate that looks like we'll have a Democratic majority, but still quite a narrow one. And when you still have senators who are, you know, 2 in particular who are quite moderate and often do not vote along with the rest of the party, I think it's going to be tough to get anything done. You know, I think there's often an impulse to kind of make that like a both sides issue, and to some degree it is. But I really do think that a greater share of the blame falls on the Republican Party for this level of gridlock. I think you have many more extremist elements in that party that will not compromise with Democrats, will not come to the table and vote against laws that are overwhelmingly popular, right? Including things like, you know, codifying the right to access contraception, and same-sex marriage, and stuff that at this point in the US is just frankly not controversial. And I think you look at the GOP's record on women's rights, on, you know, as I talked about earlier, my sort of first statement on abortion rights, but also on basic things like access to birth control, which the vast majority of American women use in their lives, and is at this point like not controversial at all among the voting public, remains controversial within the GOP. And so I do think you have a party that is pretty significantly out of step with the American public broadly. Not the whole party, you know, hashtag not all Republicans. But folks in the party that I think have really captured it and I don't want to say they dominate it, but they're starting to come close. And I do think that is a really significant impediment to getting even very common sense, basic stuff done in Congress. And I think the American people have been clear that, they would love to see, for example, some sort of paid childcare program, right? Or universal childcare program, some sort of paid leave program for parents. There are all kinds of things that are overwhelmingly popular that we have bills written on, but that are being pretty systematically blocked by Republicans.
I think that's often kind of the culture shock, I suppose, that very often people from Europe feel when we kind of get close to the US, which is the fact that things, like parental leave or even issues to do with healthcare are kind of cross-party agreements to an extent in the European context, and it doesn't really matter, no one would dare touching them too much. And if they do, they do it kind of through the back door. But in the US, they're extremely partisan and they're kind of extremely difficult to, they sound radical when, kind of we have in Europe free universal healthcare, and it's even the right-wing parties would not dare to touch that too much. So it's kind of an interesting contrast. And similarly, I suppose, with abortion at the moment, and that's kind of a big shock as well. And it's being seen, I think, as a big shock.
I'll add to Jill's comment, everything that she says is definitely part of the status quo, and it doesn't look like it's going to change greatly. But, going back to my comment about watching this particular Congress with curiosity, you've got figures like Ted Cruz, for example, saying things like we've gone too far, right? With some of these results where, again, a lot of these Trump-backed candidates lost, and we had a few surprises. And so it may just be, post-election rhetoric, but I've seen a lot of comments like that. So again, definitely the status quo, but watching this Congress with a lot of curiosity because of the results and also some of the commentary over the past 2 weeks.
Yeah,
I love
I think. Sorry, go ahead, Jill.
I said I love the optimism. I'm trying to absorb it.
Well, I think it's the kind of optimism where we might have one or two small policy surprises. Definitely not holding out for a lot of change to the status quo you were describing, but watching closely to see where there might be, a small crack that lets a little bit of light in, maybe, over this next Congress.
I wonder as well if perhaps Pablo's optimism, I share to an extent Pablo's optimism, and I wonder if it's because of our our positionality on the border and the fact that the Rio Grande Valley had been used for the last few months as almost like an example of this successful red wave that was going to benefit the Republican Party and all these Latino voters turning Republican, and a red wave that actually hasn't materialized to that extent. So I think that perhaps the optimism is also coming a little bit from that, or the fact that I think very few of us were kind of saying, it's not really a red wave, it's not really going to happen. But national media, I'm sure Pablo's had that the last few months. Here at the university, there's been kind of media requests from all sorts of national media interested in knowing about this red wave. And that was the only conversation they were willing to have. Nothing else mattered. And so that hasn't really happened as perhaps those of us here were saying. And it's kind of an optimistic view.
I think so. I think that's exactly on point. For the past year, we've had a lot of national attention here locally, a lot of projections about a huge red wave and basically how every district in the region would go to the Republican Party. And a lot of money poured in, and it looked like things were going in a different way for a little while, but they didn't turn out that way. So I think optimism is a good word, but for me, I think more it's curiosity about what comes next as well.
Excellent. So the next question, I think we've kind of touched already on some of those to an extent, but what are some of the key issues that have influenced this past election cycle? And I think we've already touched a little bit kind of reproductive rights. We've touched a little bit as well on kind of generational trends, but, you know, of course, as well, being where Pablo and I are, the kind of manufactured migration crisis that we're also seeing, you know, the busloads of people being sent to New York, for example, and kind of how that is amplified to an extent as well by the media, as if there was some kind of major crisis. So I don't know what some of those issues and that you can bring out a little bit more. And we'll start with Jill maybe this time.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, you know, abortion, huge. I think it's really hard to overstate how upset people are over that, over the Supreme Court, you know, for the first time in my lifetime and in my mother's lifetime, stripping a fundamental constitutional right from the population, right? Things usually go in the other direction. So I do think it's hard to overstate how important that was. You know, that said, I do think that the sort of pocketbook issues mattered as well. Inflation did matter, but I think what you saw from voters is that they don't necessarily trust Republicans to fix that problem either. And I think there was perhaps a more sophisticated understanding of inflation than we were led to believe. I think voters understand that this is a global problem, that there isn't just like a lever that somebody can pull and fix inflation. I think they saw that the Biden administration was taking pretty important steps to try to curb inflation. So I think that was, you know, the Democratic framing on that, emphasizing this is a global issue. This is not limited to the US. This was not like a solely Biden problem, was pretty effective. And frustration with inflation just wasn't nearly as motivating as frustration with people's fundamental rights being taken away. You know, I do think in some areas, for example, in New York State, issues like crime really resonated with voters. And I do think that's one issue that Democrats have not quite figured out how to talk about in an effective way, right? I think what we get is, you know, some folks just saying, well, there is no problem. And I think while it is obviously completely necessary to lead with facts and figures and statistics and to contextualize you know, voters' kind of perceptions of crime with the actual reality of crime, telling people, you know, what you see, what you believe is happening just isn't happening, don't worry about it. I don't know is the best political strategy. So I do think that's something that Democrats are going to have to reckon with. You know, and I think in 2 years, when it's a general election, all the voters who turned out for abortion rights, which is why Democrats turned out, are going to want to see that Democrats have done. And I know, Monica, this isn't quite the question you asked, but I do worry looking forward in 2 years that with a divided Congress, with a limited amount of political capital that frankly Joe Biden is willing to spend on abortion rights, that voters are going to hear the same message in 2 years. We need you to show up to preserve reproductive choice, to expand abortion access. And they're going to say, well, we showed up 2 years ago and like, what did you guys do? Right. So I think as Democrats are kind of taking stock right now about which issues matter, what they need to focus on, I think one thing they need to think about is, well, how do we prove to the voters who showed up for us that it was worth it? And that we did the things that we said we would do, and you know that if they do show up and turn out for us, that they're going to see some results. And I'm not sure the party has quite figured that one out yet.
If I may, I completely agree with that, and I think it's a big issue as well, because I mean, with abortion, it's not something you can wait, right? So if you need someone telling you that there's going to be some kind of future great situation where you're going to have abortion rights guaranteed in 2 years' time, that's no good if you need an abortion today. And you know, it doesn't really matter what's going to happen in 2 years. And of course, as well, for a lot of populations here in the Rio Grande Valley, for example, we have inland checkpoints 100 miles from the border. So we have large amounts of our population that cannot even travel out of state. They're actually landlocked where they are. And you know, those people are at huge danger of their fundamental rights, but also at this point, also of their lives to an extent. So it's a real, it's a real issue, and one that doesn't get resolved by people just saying go and vote Democrats. But yeah, Pablo?
Just to expand on this topic, you did mention the checkpoints. And there's a lot of people in the Rio Grande Valley who cannot travel out of state for an abortion, can't travel out of the country for an abortion. This year, we saw the last abortion clinic here in the Rio Grande Valley across the state close their doors. Earlier this year, we covered a story where a young lady, Lizelle Herrera, in Stark County here in the Rio Grande Valley was actually arrested. She spent 3 days in jail for what was basically a miscarriage. And, I share this to kind of expand a little bit. I know some of the viewers here are from outside the US, just to kind of understand, what goes on in these communities. This happens a lot in low-income communities of color. This is something that's definitely, it's a very critical issue, I think, for voters, a very urgent issue for a lot of people, especially in communities like ours. So I just wanted to share that. I think your question was, what were some of the key issues that influenced? I think one of the things that I was thinking about, apart from immigration and abortion, actually, both of those issues, which were really in the news cycle, and especially played a huge part in the rhetoric of even the gubernatorial race here in Texas as well. But apart from that, something that I saw, I think right before the elections, it was Pew who put out a big survey of the most important issues, and I saw it then. And the economy was there, and some of the issues we're talking about. But really up high, right under those, was concern for democracy, right? It was the future of democracy in the U.S. And it was very high, and it actually had the smallest gap, I think, of any issue between party affiliation. So it was something that was really like across the board. And you wouldn't think, based on media coverage, that was a really top issue. Although there were a few reports here and there to that effect. We saw a lot of analysis on voter sentiment towards immigration, abortion, but a few reports on that. But even post-election, in post-election analysis, I haven't seen too much on what role that concern played in this election. That might be because neither party is coming out with a lot of practical ideas, a lot of policies or ideas in their platforms to address that specifically. But I'll be watching any research that comes out about what role that played. And for, again, for viewers outside of the US, a lot of these questions are about what's going on in this government with regressive politics. Here in Texas, it was a huge issue. We had a redrawing of the congressional districts that was, it was challenged legally. We had some other voter suppression efforts and a lot of sort of regressive messaging paid for by PACs from outside the region and so forth. So I'm curious, in that survey, it was pretty high up. I'm curious what people were thinking about that when they went to the polls. So I think not as reported, not as much data, but I think that might be one of the big things, maybe hidden things that played a big part in this election, according to the data that I have seen, and the voters that I got to talk to during election coverage.
That's super interesting, because I suspect that, the thing you said about voters on both sides of the aisle, both putting threats to democracy relatively high up, I would suspect that those same voters diagnose the problem in polar opposite ways, right? So identify the same issue that you can kind of sum up in a poll, threats to democracy. But I would bet a lot of voters on the right see the threat to democracy as what they believe to be a stolen election. And a lot of voters on the left see the threat to democracy as the voters who believe there was a stolen election, right? So both people in both parties identifying the same issue, but seeing the problem from a completely opposite vantage point. And that's interesting. I don't know how you solve that.
Yeah, I think sorry, Pablo.
Yeah, I think absolutely. That adds more granular detail. Definitely, that's a dynamic that's going on. The only thing else, the only other thought I'll add about that, and to go back to the same idea again, is a lot of those election deniers, backed by Trump in the congressional races, and I think some other state races, again didn't do as well as we thought that they would. A small fraction of those candidates actually went on to win. So, to again, the dynamic is still there. The dynamic is still there. The rhetoric is still there. There's a lot of folks still in office who are election deniers, or at least even a lot of them tolerate that idea to sort of challenge the results of elections in the country. But again, there's that little bit of where did that change come from? And I think I guess the question in my head to say it out, to be more specific, is did some of those voters who are worried about democracy, who would have put those Trump-backed election denier candidates in office, are they thinking about this differently? What's going on in that dynamic? So again, I need to looking out for data and keeping my eyes open for anything else that could elucidate that. But definitely something there is shifting a little bit, and curious to find out what it is.
I think we'll have this kind of final question, which actually picks up very much with what we're talking about. So we kind of keep going back to the same issues, but and then we'll open the floor for questions and see what people have to ask. But there's very clearly a regressive turn in US politics, and it seems to be a sign for many things to come. And in Europe as well, we're seeing a ripple effect of this in the rise of the far right. Governments now. Italy has a far right government. Spain has been kind of having this rise far right party in a country that supposedly we didn't have any far right. So there's kind of this increasing. We'll see. We'll see what happens elsewhere, but certainly, at least from a European perspective, we're looking at the US and feeling quite scared as to what the sign of things to come might be. And we talk about obviously abortion rights, LGBTQ plus migrant rights. We haven't discussed, for example, but school shootings here in Texas. We've had Uvalde very recently with actually no policy to avoid it. And the only thing they did recently, as the school year started, was to give DNA kits to parents. As the main thing that would resolve the issue of being able to identify your child if there is a school shooting. So things that are almost kind of some nightmare sci-fi type of things rather than actual reality, but it's lived reality for many. But at the same time, the last few years have seen a huge rise of progressive movements here in the US, and particularly through the pandemic, we've seen a huge rise in unionization in Amazon, Starbucks, Whole Foods, all sorts of something that we haven't seen for a long time, but also with a lot of progressive candidates that are not scared of talking about the possibilities of free healthcare, that they're not scared of talking about reproductive rights, whether it's in Texas or elsewhere. So how can we understand those parallel and those two kind of parallel developments? And I think you choose who goes, since it's the last one.
I'll let Jill start on this.
It's just such an interesting question. I think when you look at the demographics of who is making up progressive movements in the US, what you see is demographics that are growing, right? It's young people, it's people of color, it's people who live in cities, it's people with college degrees. What I think you see then on the other side is a reaction that is kind of directly in relationship and motivated by those growing groups, right? Many human beings are scared of change. reticent to change, see big social changes not just as kind of novel and unfamiliar, but also potentially, direct threats to them. Threats not just to their way of life, but to their status. And, I think one thing that makes the US, obviously not totally unique, but I think that's such an important component part of our politics is race. And, our racial politics are particular and are peculiar to America. So, I think when you look at who really chafes against these changes, what you see are disproportionately folks whose status is derived from their racial group, right? So you tend to see mostly, older white folks, disproportionately white folks without a college degree, right? So folks who have seen their lives radically change, who have seen kind of the bottom fallout of the economy underneath them, who have seen that, they can no longer support a family, who have seen the politics of families radically shift, right? When you look at, for example, marriage rates and who's getting married these days today, folks with college degrees are much more likely to marry in the first place. They're much more likely to marry before they have children rather than the reverse, and they're more likely to stay married. So you see kind of more, paradoxically, perhaps, more traditional families on the part of people who are voting for progressive policies, and this kind of breakdown of traditional family in communities of folks who are then voting for very conservative reactionary politics. And I do think those things are related. I think that there is often a human impulse to blame one's situation on the kind of person who's adjacent to you, but just different enough to be envious of, if that makes sense, right? But not someone you know well enough to really relate to. So, one statistic that I think, or maybe it's not a statistic, but sort of political science observation that I always find interesting is that you see kind of typically the most anti-immigrant sentiment, not among people who live in big cities that are teeming with immigrants, and not even really among, well, to some degree, folks that, live in very, very homogenous places. But you see the most anti-immigrant sentiment among folks who live kind of adjacent to cities, who see that there's some change happening, right, among because of immigrant populations, but aren't actually interacting with immigrants, aren't actually interacting with businesses that immigrants own, aren't actually having their lives impacted in any way, but can see that life is changing. And that does seem to spur anger, frustrations, xenophobia, bigotry, right? And so, I do think this dynamic that as folks in cities become more progressive, more open-minded, cities become more diverse, that is directly a factor fueling the reaction to that, right? Among people who see that, not just as weird and different, but also a direct threat to the status that they derive from having been the dominant class in a country.
Excellent, thanks. That's really good point. Pablo.
Definitely a dynamic that's at play. Everything that Jill is talking about, definitely a dynamic that's at play, and a dynamic that's at play in Texas specifically, and all over the country. The way that I understood this dynamic, is the way that I saw it play out here in the Rio Grande Valley, is the fact that sort of state and national Democratic parties aren't doing enough at a local level. And we've heard this I know we've heard this in New York, we're hearing this in Nevada, definitely here in Texas, and definitely in one of the most contested congressional districts in the whole country, here in Texas, District 15, which runs, through the Rio Grande Valley up to almost San Antonio. If you look at these races, there's various kinds of friction between local and state and national Democratic parties, but you can usually draw the line of division between progressive Democrats and establishment Democrats. And so I think one of the things that's happening is that, yes, you have these progressive candidates running on one side, and you've got the dynamic Jill is talking about definitely on the other, and some of these other causes of more progressive politics. But I think that there's a lot of candidates across the country in the past few years and even now. I mean, in South Texas, we had one of the most progressive candidates ever to run in this region, and she was nominated, by the people through a local nonprofit who put that process together when TX15 suddenly didn't have a Democratic candidate to run, as a result of the incumbent switching to a different district. But the state and national Democratic Party, they didn't have the funds that people really needed locally for that particular candidate. They didn't have a candidate ready. That was something that came from sort of a local grassroots effort here. And so I think that the Democratic Party is sort of playing catch up a little bit with a lot of the stuff that's going on the right as well. And so we're seeing a lot of that progressive change, I think, that's has not received national party support for a long time, now really just coming up as a response to what's happening on the right. And so I think that that's sort of one of the reasons, or I guess the dynamic, right, that I saw in terms of, you've got some very regressive rhetoric on one side, very regressive platforms on one side, but on the other, we're beginning to see a lot more progressive, a lot more movement to the left as well. And I think it has to do with this sort of new generation of more progressive Democratic candidates who are finally just, working their way up through this machine now that has not really supported them in the past and other election cycles. So I think we're going to keep seeing that regressive messaging from some Republican campaigns, but I think the moment is ripe also for the Democratic Party to embrace that new generation, as some of those Democratic leaders are mentioning. I know I mentioned Nancy Pelosi talking about that in her recent announcement. But to go back again to some of those comments from the GOP, we're seeing a lot of people say in the Republican Party that Trump is over, his candidates are over. We've seen comments, like I mentioned, from Ted Cruz. I think the GOP is going to calibrate a little bit, and I'm sorry, this is more outside the question you're asking, but into the future, I think the GOP will calibrate a little bit. I think the Democrats are sort of inching closer to closing that gap between their sort of progressive and establishment structures, right? So there's been a lot of divisiveness, a lot of regressiveness. But again, that newish dynamic makes me very curious about where this is going. And so there may be, at least a slight, very general move towards the left, maybe between those two dynamics. But that's how I saw it play out here regionally. And the progressive candidates did not win. We had Republican Mònica de la Cruz take a congressional 15. And so she's had some of the, she's maybe not the most regressive rhetoric in the party, but definitely along the lines of what we've been talking about here today on the right. So it'll be interesting to see how that dynamic plays out.
Yeah, completely. And actually, it's interesting with that district because it was completely gerrymandered. I think Pablo might correct me, but I don't know if it was like 300 or 400 miles long as a district. It's kind of like a line. And when you look at the actual election result, the urban areas voted for the progressive Democratic candidate, and it's actually this kind of rural areas that were incorporated into the district that voted for the Republican candidate. Something that Texas is, you can spot Texas urban areas by voting patterns versus rural areas, and I think that's something quite common in other places. But we've kind of reached the last parts. I'd like to invite the audience to share or to ask or to kind of contribute. I si voleu fer alguna pregunta en català, la podeu fer en català i traduiré. Però ara obrim el torn de preguntes o comentaris. So maybe if people want to put their hand up, I think. Otherwise, I see some known names, so I might do like I do in class and pick on people. I won't. Do we have any questions for Pablo or for Jill, or anything we want to share? We have don't have any questions.
Maybe I have a question. Following the results, what do you think about the future of Trump's candidacy? Is he now stronger than 2 weeks ago? Is he out of the race already? What do you think?
I think the shortest, the sort of most succinct answer I can give to that is that the first time Trump won was a huge surprise, and it seemed that a lot of people voted for Trump to make a point at that time, and so I don't know if I would want to project what's going to happen with Trump or try to predict what's going to happen with Trump, but I would say that what happens is sort of going to be dependent on whether people are done making a point or not, because we are hearing a lot of conversation on the right about how it's time to move on. Partially, a lot of people support Trump, of course. He still has his following, but I think it depends on that. And so, I think that's my understanding of it right now. If I don't know how viable a Trump candidacy would be, just even legally at this point, logistically. I mean, he's under investigation for all sorts of things. So we don't know how that's going to play out, or if his run is even. I mean, we know now that his original run was not serious. That we know now, and I think we have. I don't remember what journalist it was, but we found there's a little piece of audio or something like that to the effect that he never intended to win at all. So it's hard to tell. It's even from that point, when you have a candidate that's so unpredictable and so disgenuine about even whether the campaign is real or not, it's difficult to predict what will go on there.
Jill, you're muted.
Sorry, I'm muted. I would never count Trump out. I also absolutely do not trust my instincts on this, because I thought he would lose by a huge margin in 2016, as did I think almost everyone else, including his own team. And look what happened. I think the next couple months are going to be really interesting, seeing how the party reacts and seeing how Trump reacts, particularly to Governor DeSantis, who does at the moment seem to be the Republican, kind of the strongest potential Republican challenger to Trump. I mean, I know we have a lot of folks listening who maybe are not in the US and not super engaged in US politics, but to me, one of the most telling aspects of the Trump presidency is that in 2020, the Republican Party just didn't have a platform. Right. So parties always have platforms, and they list out what the party stands for ideologically and what policies they're going to put out there. And in 2020, the GOP essentially said, our platform is we support Donald Trump. And more or less whatever Trump decides, and Trump is a pretty idiosyncratic leader that doesn't always have a clear set of policy goals or even, frankly, a clear ideology. The party basically said, whatever this guy says, we're going to back. Which is totally terrifying, right? Because that's just some strongman authoritarian stuff. But that is, I think, what the culmination of Trumpism, right? Of just, it's a cult of personality around this one man. And so the question is, have the midterms, if Trump now losing an election, has that damaged that cult of personality significantly enough that other Republicans in power will throw their weight behind, a Ron DeSantis, that somebody like Ron DeSantis will even throw his hat in the ring and survive the inevitable barrage of insults from Team Trump, right? I think one thing that we perhaps underestimate is a degree to which I think a lot of Trump supporters really enjoy the cruelty, really enjoy the meanness. That kind of like hand-to-hand combat is kind of exciting. And they like seeing him win those kind of like petty insult fights. So once he's challenged and he goes back to that kind of old way of dealing with potential challengers, will that then fire up his base? Or will that be a moment when the Republican Party, basically says enough of this guy? I don't know, but I think the next like 3 or 4 months are going to be very, very telling.
Yeah, I agree. I think I've given up giving any kind of predictions since 2016 on the politics of any country I follow, because clearly I didn't do very well with any of the predictions I had prior. So that's the answer. I agree. I'm not the kind of, I wouldn't give out anything. So we have 3 minutes left, and unless somebody puts their hand up, I'll let you kind of just say some final words as to anything that we haven't touched upon that you might think it might be important, or just to sum up whatever you've already said, if there is nothing else. So Pablo or Jill, what do you?
The last thought that I'll give is that, especially for people both here and outside the country, when watching election coverage, check the data, always check the data, what's going on with the numbers, because especially in the US, we've got a media that puts out narratives that may not necessarily be based on facts. So I think that's the biggest thing I can share today. And the thought that I'll leave you with is always double check the numbers, I guess.
Yeah, I guess my sort of final thought is that I love events like this one where we can kind of have some cross-national discussion. And I think it is really crucial to understand where each of our countries and communities are kind of on a global scale. And, I know I keep talking about abortion. That's the issue I write about the most. It's the one I'm the most kind of familiar with. But I think it is very telling that as countries have become more democratic and as places have leaned more into liberal democracy, they have expanded human rights, expanded women's rights, and expanded abortion rights. And that's a massive global trend, right? We're seeing it in sub-Saharan Africa. We're really seeing it in Latin America. And so that's been really exciting, I think, for feminists everywhere. We're then seeing a bit of the flip side of that, right? Which is thankfully, a much smaller number of countries are becoming more authoritarian, leaning away from liberal democracy, and in the process, curtailing women's rights and often specifically curtailing abortion rights, as well as targeting outsiders, immigrants, and LGBT people. So we're seeing that in Hungary, we're seeing it in Russia, we're seeing it in Poland, we're seeing it in China, and we're seeing it in Nicaragua, and we're seeing it in the US. And those are kind of like the big handful. And so I think understanding American politics and our turn away from abortion rights towards someone like Trump in those global terms is really useful to both understand kind of how the world is moving, I think, in 2 separate directions. Asking ourselves which side we want the US to be on. And then also looking to other global movements that have pushed back against authoritarianism, have pushed forward when it comes to women's rights, and asking, what can we learn from those movements? What can US women learn from the green movements in Latin America, right? And how can we adapt those techniques and strategies to move ourselves hopefully back on the path of liberal democracy, human rights, and women's rights?
think that's an excellent way of finishing it, and I think one that will also connect with the audience. I mean, in the Spanish state, we've had in the last few years, particularly, a huge wave of feminist movements with women's strikes on the 8th of March, and several of those, and you know, there's been a huge following of the struggles for the right to abortion in Ireland that were successful just before the pandemic, and of course the Latin American struggles that have been quite successful. So yeah, I think that's an excellent way of finishing it, and I suppose with an element as well of optimism. And so I just wanted to thank Jill and Pablo so much for your time and for agreeing to do this. And I'm kind of really happy, and I want to also thank Antoni for kind of setting up the Zoom and providing everything. And so we'll be uploading this to the Sociologia Catalana de Ciència Política YouTube channel. So we'll kind of send the links through Twitter if Twitter still exists by the time we upload it on YouTube. And thank you everyone as well for joining us. And maybe we can just kind of say thank you to our speakers.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Right, so I think we'll finish it and we'll leave it here at 11:01, 6:01 in Catalan time.